It's been very interesting for me to be here the past couple of days to see what happens when you start to bring the full spectrum from the very clever science modelly people and the academics who have lots of time to think about things to us that are working in the implementation space. And when I get to the end of what I'm showing you, you'll see how we are begging for time in what we're doing, and the time frames that we're working with compared to the time frames that you work with are orders of magnitude different. So, it's starting to highlight for me how valuable the partnerships that can come out of all of the different people working in this room, how valuable they can be to embedding and understanding and doing the work we do. So the work of the NIE essentially is in a lot of the boxes on the what we need side, where we are taking the work into practice. What is the NIE? Just very briefly, you're all familiar with the Kyoto Protocol. Under the Kyoto Protocol, a finance mechanism was created called the Adaptation Fund. Now, most of these kinds of funds access their resources through multilateral implementing entities. You'll know that the GEF accesses through the World Bank, the UNDP, and so on. An innovation of the Adaptation Fund is to access or to create access mechanisms that they call direct access, which is via national implementing entities. And that's what an NIE is. SANBI was accredited to be the NIE, the National Implementing Entity for South Africa, just before COP17. And what I'm going to do in the next couple of minutes is take you through some of our journey and hopefully hook you in to some of the opportunities for future co-stuff. So co-creating, collaborating, etc. Okay, so the process that we followed, essentially COP17, accreditation, operationalization took a little while. We had to figure out how we would get this thing going inside of SANBI. Eventually, we found the resources, and we started off looking at governance. Set up a governance structure, and on it is SANBI, whose CEO leads, the Department of Environment Affairs, National Treasury, Planning Commission, and the Adaptation Network. And it's worthwhile showing you there that some of the questions around political support, how do we get political support for the work? You can see how we're starting to think about getting political support for the work by entrenching the Planning Commission and Treasury right in the highest governance structures of the NIE. And already this is starting to mainstream some of the discussions we're having into the processes that are ongoing. We then moved into a consultation process that helped us develop an investment framework. Many of you were at the meeting. It was at the end of October, at the end of last year, and involved many of the kinds of groups of people that are in this room. That's a picture from it. And it produced an investment framework that, and I won't go through all of this, but essentially what it said is this investment opportunity needs to make the case for why investing in climate change adaptation is a good idea. So we've got $10 million potentially to play with if we move quickly enough and access the funds. So that's our urgency in the background. But essentially what our community said, or the people feeding back to us said, is we want you to invest in projects that build on existing partnerships, that are multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary, that are embedded in existing programs of work, that are cost-effective and sustainable, and that very importantly produce concrete and tangible results that people can see in the kinds of communities that politicians are interested in seeing results happen in. So we don't want to work with a bunch of commercial farmers here, neither would the Adaptation Fund really, but we want to work with vulnerable communities who are typical of the kinds of vulnerable communities that climate change is going to affect in South Africa. So just to summarize that this is really an opportunity to make the case for investments in climate change adaptation and to learn, honestly, from our successes and our mistakes. And already we're learning. It's not a linear process. Okay, then we issued a call for proposals. We received roughly 78 proposals. I have to say I found the results of the survey where people said they knew about climate change interesting because our proposals showed us that people actually don't know very much about climate change adaptation. The quality was extremely weak. And it's highlighted for us an important need to build capacity in the groups that we're wanting to be working with around these programs of work. We set up a task team under the steering committee, selected 2 proposals, and then built them up into 2 concepts that were eventually submitted to the Adaptation Fund Board for consideration as concepts. And I'll take you through what these 2 concepts were. So the first one is a project in the Umgeni catchment in South Africa, in KwaZulu-Natal. It's the catchment that feeds Durban with its water, for those of you that don't know. It's in the Ungunglovo district municipality, and that municipality is the lead on this project. They're the executing entity. So very exciting to be able to implement a program of work through a local authority, or through a district municipality in this case. This area's climate predictions are temperature increases, late onset of rains, and more extreme weather events. And the project responds by saying we're going to do these things: early warning systems, climate-proof settlements that combine ecological and engineering approaches, climate-resilient agriculture, and a program of learning lessons. A theme all the way through is connecting the science to the indigenous and traditional knowledge, and starting to figure out ways that if we develop an early warning system, we collect in all the clever science from all the different climate weather stations, we bring it into fire, we bring it into water, and at the same time we work with local communities to say, how do you want to respond if such a thing is going to be happening in the areas in which you live? And just to give you an idea of what these areas look like, this is a typical area. These are the typical low-lying crossings that go across rivers. Here are some more of them. And these are the very rivers that flash flood every single year, with deaths to children going to school, people crossing the rivers to go to places that they're going. And something that I think is worth highlighting in our experience, and maybe it's something that's obvious, but it's that climate change exacerbates existing vulnerabilities. So when you're working in the former homeland areas of South Africa, where people are incredibly vulnerable already, living in poverty, not with a whole lot of options, and climate change comes into these areas, the vulnerabilities get worsened. And so what's quite interesting in the climate space is how when you're in the international negotiation space and you speak about climate finance, it's all about adding finance to the existing finance that's committed to development, and the need to show that climate finance is an additional thing. When you're working in these projects, you can't really separate between what's needed for climate response and what's needed for development. So it starts to throw up an interesting set of challenges about how donors want to see that their money is just being spent on the additionality, but actually how can you work in an area like this and say, all I'm going to do is, what, build your bridge, or whatever the very narrow climate response will be. So it's quite an interesting lesson for us, how you need to work across disciplines, you need to work at all levels, and you need to work in a really slow, deliberate way to make sure that you're being bottom up in the way that you're building partnerships and communities of practice around the interventions that you're putting in place. Another area typical, this is a peri-urban area outside of Pietermaritzburg. You can see the stormwater drains along the roads. You can see what the water damage is doing and how people are responding with tires. You can see how vulnerable the houses are. Now you can imagine an area like this that has increased storm events, what that's going to do to these kinds of communities. And of course, here's a landscape example where you can see cows overgrazing. There's an overgrazed grassland. Play that when seasonal rains are late, so the grassland is dry, so the cows are grazing even lower in terms of affecting the vegetation that's there. The topsoil runs off into the wetlands. The wetlands silt up. And then now to give you the story back again, those wetlands are where bricks come from. When the wetlands silt up, bricks can't get made from clay, so they get made of material that's weaker. Then the houses, the roofs, can't be as high up on the houses as they need to be. The roofs are lower, the tornadoes come, and not just the roof blows off, but the whole house blows in half. So you can start to see how the natural environment interplays with the built environment and presents a very interesting integrated picture and a very interesting story of how we need to approach this climate change adaptation space in a completely integrated way. And of course, I'm not even touching on all the different sectors that would need to play out here. I'm just touching on the ones that this particular project is focusing in on. It's maybe worth saying here that we're working with a whole suite, or the district is working with a whole suite of actors from different government departments at different spheres of government, LIMA, Built Environment Support Group, WWF, WESA, etc. Okay, the second project, Small Grant Facility Project, this responds to a call to really work with direct access by working directly with the CBOs and NGOs that are wanting this kind of support, where they can articulate for themselves what the responses will be. I'm being hurried along, so I won't explain this picture to you. Maybe just to say that the concepts were submitted. Both concepts were approved for further development, and we're in the project development space at the moment. It's complicated, the process of developing these projects. It takes a long time. We don't have a long time because the clock is ticking, and if we don't access our $10 million quickly, they're going to give it to someone else. Not really, we're making the case to go slower. But you can see the kinds of pressures that we're under to move into the implementation space and access the resources quickly, and at the same time be true to the principles that we are all speaking about and the principles we think we need to be honoring in our processes. By working slowly, we are developing real roots on which these projects can stand. And those are some of the things that the project development process is showing us or enabling for us. Guy mentioned that we presented our work at the COP. Absolutely, we're being highly regarded by the international community. Not only are we showing how to do this work, but we're showing that NIEs are a good idea. And we're learning as we go. And maybe just to underscore that we would greatly value an opportunity to collaborate, especially with people in this room that bring some of the deep, slow, thoughtful, insightful process work that we don't have the time to do in these projects, but it could complement these projects beautifully. So last slide, just summarizing. We're showing that good process takes time for a whole bunch of reasons. It's a very interesting policy response to say we need more time when the Adaptation Fund itself is being hammered to spend its money as quickly as possible. Through the NIE, we've unlocked domestic resources. We're building long-term institutional support for adaptation. We're triggering very interesting discussions about sustainable financial instruments for climate change adaptation. Having Treasury on the steering committee helps them to say, hang on a second, we think there's a gap in the market for small grants. How can we create that over the next 5 years? So hopefully those discussions will bear some positive results. We've been able to develop the Adaptation Fund funded projects as part of a coherent country-driven program. We think that's a big strength as an NIE as opposed to an MIE, a multilateral implementing entity that zooms in, chooses a project, and zooms out again. And that's it. Thanks very much.